So the subject of my talk this evening is, as it says across the top there, the use of Aphengescopes by philatelic societies in the period 1900 through 1910. And the background to it is there in this introductory synopsis, basically, that the annual reports at the Royal, which originally was called the Philatelic Society London, that's what it was known as from 1869 until 1906, they were being isolated into a searchable form. Yeah, so we were taking our annual reports and we were turning them into an electronic form. And the act of doing that cast fresh light onto a report from June 1901 that included information about an exhibition that was given by somebody called W.B. Avery of his Aphengescope lantern apparatus, by which magnified reflections of stamps were being shown on the screen. So having read that rather led me to seek answers to the questions of who was W.B. Avery and just what was his Aphengescope. So in outline, my presentation is as follows. There is the annual report that I referred, that I read in full. I'll leave that there for you to read. But my presentation, therefore, will explain who W.B. Avery was, and we'll get some appreciation of his stamp collection. We'll look at what an Aphengescope was, and I'll put that into some historic perspective. And I'll conclude by looking at its use by indeed not only the Philatelic Society London, but also at the Birmingham Philatelic Society between 1900 and 1910. So, who was this chap? Who was Mr. W.B. Avery? Well, it turns out he was Sir William Bailey Avery, first baronet, and he lived from 1854 until 1908. And he was a British philatelist. And actually, his name was entered on the roll of distinguished philatelists in 1921 as being one of the fathers of Philatelie. So clearly, he must have been a really outstanding philatelist to be treated in that way. There's a picture of him there on the side. And his grandfather was the elder brother in W&T Avery, weighing machine makers of Birmingham. Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard of Avery scales, weighing machines and scales. So once I understood that that's who he was, it all kind of made sense in terms of which firm it was that he was involved with. And as I've explained there, until he retired, he was a manager of a large part of that business. But in 1891, he retired as managing director, although he did retain a seat on the board of the company. He was the third son of William Henry Avery of Edgbaston, and William Bailey Avery was created a baronet in December 1905. He was married twice. He first married to a lady called Anna Louisa Bell, and they had a son, William Eric Thomas Avery, who succeeded to his title. So he became the second baronet Avery. And after Anna died in 1902, Sir William went on to marry a lady in Paris, Susanna Matilda Kretz. In addition to being the managing director of W&T Avery, he was a director of United Rhodesian and Goldfields, Ada Rack and Company Limited, and Commonwealth Oil Corporation Limited, and some other major businesses. So he was a director of multiple firms. He was very well to do. He lived at Apsley House in Birmingham, and indeed was a life governor of Birmingham University. But he also maintained a house, Oakley Court, at Bray, near Windsor, so here in Berkshire, and a house in Portland Place, London, which is where he died in 1908. Let's just have a little look at Oakley Court, as that's almost in our neighbourhood. He entertained his philatelic friends regularly there with style and grace. And so, for instance, in July of 1897, during the London Philatelic Exhibition, there was an organised river trip and visit to Oakley Court on the Saturday, the 24th of July. And the people on that trip, they obviously went on the trip. They got on a train from Paddington and took them to Taplow railway station. And they ended up visiting Oakley Court, indeed the home of William Avery. In 1906, there was another international Philatelic exhibition, and on the 31st of May of that year, again they organised a charming excursion, again with a river trip, and a visit to Windsor Castle, including a nice lunch at the White Hart Hotel in Windsor, and then a steam launch left later to take them to Oakley Court, where Sir William Avery had kindly invited visitors to take tea. And we see there's the menu there on the side from the White Hart Hotel, and a menu for the tea that he had laid on at Oakley Court. And indeed, that's the inside of the tea menu. And apparently it was very beautiful there. It had lovely grounds and so on. And his sister had sorted things out because his wife unfortunately was ill, but there was certainly very good hospitality there for all of his visitors on that occasion. But he also showed the visitors his wonderful strong room and some of the treasures of his fine collection. So let's think a bit more about his stamp collection. It was vast, to be honest, because it was a comprehensive general collection of the stamps of the whole world, covering the period 1840 through 1890. And he had acquired collections and individual items and amassed something like 100,000 stamps. So it wasn't just a couple of albums. He'd started collecting at the age of eight, and after 9 years, he sold his collection actually in 1871. But then about 7 years later, he built up a collection again, but again, he sold portions of it in about 1887. But I think with all this buying and selling, he acquired a superb collection of the stamps of Australia, including many fine Sydney views, and also collections of the West Indies and Western Australia. He also owned a unique, large, unused block of the Swiss double Geneva, and he also had fine holdings of Moldavia and Nevis. With extensive buying in England and Europe, he built one of the finest collections of his day. Now, I mentioned that he retired quite early. At the age of 39, he stepped away from his family business and pursued a life of leisure, and he joined many philatelic organisations. He joined the Philatelic Society London in 1891 and was made a fellow of that society in 1907. He was the honorary president of the Birmingham Philatelic Society, and indeed was also the vice president of the Hertfordshire Philatelic Society. By all accounts, he entertained his philatelic friends regularly with style and grace. He was always well dressed, and he had a genial persona, and he became a popular member of what was becoming a well-established philatelic community of the world's greatest stamp collectors. So there, for example, is something he had in his collection, 20 of the penny black VR stamps. Now, those had never been issued. They'd been prepared, but the idea was that the idea that they were going to be used was actually shelved. And so apart from a small number of copies, the entire print was destroyed. So that was clearly a very rare thing for him to have in his collection. I mentioned the double Geneva. He had a large unused block of the Swiss double Geneva. There's a photo of the block that he had there on the left, and a bit of detail as to what the stamps looked like. They were indeed that color green. You know, they were the third oldest stamp of the whole of the European continent. Obviously, penny black was first, and then the Zurich 4 and 6 Rappen, and then the Geneva, then the double Geneva. So very early stamps indeed. He also had, I mentioned Nevis. He also had an outstanding collection of Nevis, including proof sheets of the 1862 stamps. But he really did love the stamps, the rare stamps of Moldavia. And he made it his business to track down complete sets of them. He had numerous examples of the 4 stamps. And amongst it, well, probably his most important pieces were unused examples of the penny and tuppenny Post Office Mauritius stamps that had been issued in 1847, which he managed to acquire in 1893. So that's some examples of the really outstanding items that he had in his stamp collection. But what was an Aphengescope then that he was using at the Philatelic Society? Well, I started off by looking up what it was. I reached for a dictionary, and I found that it's an Aphengescope is a modification of the magic lantern for exhibiting opaque objects. So I looked into it a bit more detail, and I can see that the French referred to them as Mégascopes, and in German they were called Aphengescope or Wunderkamera für Undurchsichtige, which means things you can't see through. So yes, it was an opaque lantern in which the images were projected onto a screen by reflection instead of by transmitting the light through transparencies. Okay, so the light would reflect off the thing and rather than shine through it. Okay, so the first lantern of this type appears to have been invented by the Swiss mathematician and engineer Leonhard Euler, and he actually described it in his letters to a German princess. The letter that he wrote in 1762 recorded that he had the honor of presenting the princess with one of the lanterns 6 years before, so that would have been 1756. So he probably was the first person to have come up with this idea. And basically, the object to be optically projected was placed in the back of the lantern in the diagram there, shown in position B. And opposite, in a sliding tube, was in the front of the lantern. In the front of the lantern was a projection lens, and that's shown by A in that. And then there were 2 side wings with lamps and mirrors to illuminate the object. And prior to Euler inventing this, it seems that sun's rays were used to illuminate an object, the image of which was then thrown upon a screen. So I think what Euler did was kind of think about how we could actually do it with some sort of lamps and mirrors rather than just relying on the sun's rays. Now, it turns out that there is a more general term for an optical device for projecting flat opaque images, and that's a thing called an Episcope. And so it can deal with postcards, prints, photos, stamps, books, and pages in books, and so on, but also 3-dimensional objects such as small machine parts and coins and so on. And the illustration on the right shows a modern opaque projector of a basic design, and the object is placed upside down at the rear of the lantern, sometimes at the top or at the bottom, as the image will be inverted by the projection lens. An intense light, often from 2 sources, illuminates the object from the sides, and hence a part of the reflected light passes through the projecting lens, which projects an image onto a screen. And nowadays, actually, episcopes are still used by artists and draftsmen when they copy or enlarge drawings by tracing the projected image. So they're still used. There's obviously a modern electrical one there illustrated on the right. Now, an epidiascope is a similar beast, but it's for projecting both transparent slides and opaque objects. And of course, that combination makes it ideal for use in schools. So clearly an Aphengescope was an episcope, because that's what it was used for, was for projecting flat opaque images. Now, in January 1802, a magician and showman, Paul de Philipsthal, He actually took out a patent that covered, amongst other things, the projection of opaque objects and transparencies to be reduced or enlarged to facilitate the painting of pictures. But really practical instruments were not really constructed until about 1839, when a Robert Longbottom used a very bright light from oxyhydrogen in conjunction with opaque lanterns, with which he gave exhibitions at the Royal Polytechnic Institution in London, which had opened in August 1838. The first popular lantern for the projection of opaque objects was actually constructed by Chadbourne and Sons in Liverpool in 1865, but they didn't patent their design. It was first demonstrated at a meeting of the Liverpool Chemists Association in that year, and it's possible that the publication of the details in a German photographic paper in June of 1865 led the German firm of Kruss to design their own. Because later in 1868, Kruss patented in England their lantern for the projection of opaque objects. And in that plan view of the on the right there in the diagram, the objects were positioned on the inside of a small hinged door at position A, and the light from the lamp, shown at B, and the reflector behind it concentrated the light on the object by condensers at position C, and the picture was then obviously projected by the lens, which is shown at position D in the diagram. There were small circular ventilation holes, and the lines indicate the housing of the lamp assembly. Pretty obviously that lamp assembly was going to get hot, so that's why they had all these ventilation holes in it. The term Wunderkamera, which obviously is anglicized as wonder camera, was given to this lantern and then used generically for any lantern that could be used for opaque projections. But the one that Kruss came up with in 1868 was the original Wunderkamera. Now, these did then start to become quite popular, and here we see an advert from the optical department of the London Stereoscopic and Photographic Company in the Boys' Journal of 1867 that mentions the availability of an Aphengescope for just £2 and 2 shillings. As it says, can be adapted to the magic lantern. So these things were, were advertised and indeed were available for sale. Now, in an Aphengescope, great illumination power was necessary if a large picture was to be projected on a screen. You could get fair results by using just an ordinary optical lantern with, as the source of illumination. But when very large pictures were needed, 2 lanterns could be used. And it was very popular for projecting enlarged views of small-sized cards, lithographs, stamps, etc. And the diagram on the right shows how the light from 2 lanterns falling onto a stamp, envelope, or card could reflect and project through a lens, with the stamp, etc., mounted on the hinge door at the back. So a practical form of Aphengescope for attachment to optical lanterns was hexagonal in plan and made of either wood or metal. And at the back, there were 2 doors that permitted one object to be shown while another was being prepared. At the front, there were 3 holes, the central one having a flange to receive lantern objective of long focus and large diameter, and the side holes, which were bushed with brass tubing, could receive the draw tubes of two lanterns. And then the object to be shown was placed in the Aphengescope behind the objective lens. We see here a couple of examples, one shown from the front, one shown from the back, so we can really see what these small attachments that went on the magic lanterns, what they looked like. The one on the left there actually dates from about 1880. I mentioned, of course, that fair results could be obtained by using an ordinary lantern containing just one source of illumination. So some of these were designed to fit a single lantern, and in French they were called Mégascopes. And so we see on this page from a catalogue the sort of Mégascope design that could be attached to a single lantern. And the diagram there obviously explains how that would work, how the light from a single lantern would be reflected and go through the lens. They were, as I say, this term megascope was the French term for it, and there's an article on the left there about electrical megascopes being used to project a photograph onto a screen, or indeed, photographs in general. And the point about the fact that the image had to, or the item had to be put in upside down in order for the image to be projected the correct way up. And that postcard there shows one of these episcopes being used at a lecture in the pathological anatomy laboratory at the School of Military Health Service in Lyon in France. Now, the use of a Aphengescope was quite popular by the 1880s, and actually the Boy's Own paper carried a two-part article in March of 1884 on how to make one. And this was described as a simple contrivance which will cost but a few pence. And you can see there, I've got the two parts of the article there, and it was written by a chap called Frank Chasemore. And in 1890, it was actually repeated as a single article in the Boy's Own Book of Indoor Games and Recreations. But I love the way that he describes how he made it. I think he mentioned that he used cigar boxes to starting off with, and so on. So he talked in this article. He talked about this, the simple way of making it. But obviously, that was the idea, was that was like a homemade one. Here, clearly, is a patented, professionally made one. Again, we can see this sort of hexagonal shape. This one, as we see, was really meant for projecting images of carte de visites, and beautifully made, obviously, with the brass lens and so on. And again, by having those two doors, you could have one card being shown whilst you put the other one in the other door, ready to swap the doors over. And this is how it attached to two lanterns. You can see there how the light from those two lanterns would obviously fill that Aphengescope box. Now, I mentioned Episcopes, and of course, I think by about the 1950s, the use of Aphengescopes had given way to the use of other types of Episcopes. And hobby and mechanics magazines were publishing how to make them. So although back in the 1880s, there was that article about how to make an Aphengescope, here we see in the 1950s, you've asked to know how to make an Episcope. And so this issue of Hobbies Weekly had an article explaining all of that, how to make an Episcope. There was also, through Practical Mechanics, you could actually obtain a blueprint on how to make an Episcope. That was in 1957. To go with the blueprint, obviously there was a whole set of instructions as to what to do. And it's interesting just looking at sort of the key points, the key considerations that are mentioned in these instructions. But the principle is that the object to be projected is floodlit by means of lamps and reflectors. A lens is placed so that some of the light reflected from the surface of the object is focused on the screen. As the screen illumination is comparatively feeble, this type of projector is more dependent on the use of a darkened room than other types of projector. And the main problem with the design of an Episcope is to ensure sufficiently bright screen image without overheating what is being projected. So those are clearly important considerations. So we've looked at what Aphengescopes were let's have a look at their use by philatelic societies. I mentioned that there was this sort of summary report about what had gone on in the 1900 to 1901 season. This is a detailed report as to what happened on Friday, the 7th of December, 1900, in the evening at, say, 7:45. So Mr. Avery had given members of the society an Aphengescope exhibition with original stamps illustrated on screen, very considerably magnified. And he'd put up numerous stamps, and they were able to really examine the lines of the design, note differences in different types of stamps, and indeed detect some forgeries. And obviously, having given his talk and his display, there was a vote of thanks, and he expressed the hope that his instrument might be the means of facilitating the expert committee, because maybe he thought that the expert committee could make use of this sort of equipment for really examining the stamps, in a very large image. So this was the first mention of an Aphengescope being used by the Philatelic Society, London. But reports in subsequent volumes of the London Philatelist concerned meetings of the Birmingham Philatelic Society, and they revealed that this type of equipment was used for several years on quite a regular basis by that society, in particular during the winter months, I noticed. So there was reports for, February 1903, January 1905, January 1907, 1908, 1910. And in every case, it seems that this one person was responsible for using the Aphengescope, and that was Mr. J.A. Margocius. That was John Arthur Margocius. And he would show stamps on the screen in their natural colors. So they used them a lot at the up there in Birmingham at the Birmingham Philatelic Society over quite a number of years. Now, I wondered also about magic lanterns generally being used for philatelic lectures, and certainly around this time, as we see in February 1905, the Junior Philatelic Society London held an exhibition of the postage stamps of Great Britain, and there were lantern lectures on the humorous and entertaining sides of postal and stamp matters. One that I'm sure Alastair would have enjoyed, His Majesty's Mails, or How the GPO is Run, on the 3rd of February of 1905, and on the 4th of February, Postage Stamps with Stories, the anecdotal, historical, and romantic phases of stamp collecting. And in both cases, they were done as magic lantern magic lantern lectures. Also in 1906, the same man gave again his interesting lectures to numerous audiences. So they were certainly using magic lanterns for philatelic lectures a lot in the 1900 through 1910 period. So what was the advantage of using an Aphengescope as opposed to just using a magic lantern? Well, the glass magic lantern slides were made using black and white photography. There's an example on the left there. And therefore, of course, the grayscale transparent images that were projected using a magic lantern would show the detail, but not the natural colors. Look how that magic lantern slide on the left there with the stamps of toga. All the stamps are shown in black and white. Those Queensland stamps, yes, great detail, but again, black and white. So being able to project a large image of a stamp using an Aphengescope meant that the stamps could be seen in detail in their actual colors. And if we therefore imagine being able, instead of seeing a magic lantern slide of those toga stamps in black and white, if instead we could see a reflected projection of the stamps in color, we can see clearly the advantage of being able to do that, to see those in really large size projected up onto a wall or a screen. And actually, glass magic lantern slides continued for many years, and we see some examples there from of the stamps of Newfoundland that were issued in 1910, 1921, and 1930. Those glass magic lantern slides are all grayscale. We can see that. But imagine if instead they'd used an Aphengescope to look at the blue 5-cent stamp, the brown 35-cent stamp, and the green 36-cent stamp. How much clearer it would have been in terms of the actual color of the stamps. So this really does emphasize the advantage of using an Aphengescope. And it's no surprise then that in 1902, when the Birmingham Philatelic Society, in its meeting in February, put on a display, that they did so, and that meant that the apparatus reflected the stamps in their natural colors, and they were able to cover such things as the picturesque, being the pretty and plentiful stamps, magnified minor monstrosities, I love that title, and forgeries, and these were very, very much appreciated by the audience. So, the Birmingham Philatelic Society used an Aphengescope for nearly a decade, certainly from 1902 to 1910, but there is no record of any long-term use by the Philatelic Society London, or more particularly by its expert committee. So in conclusion, in modern times, we're obviously all very used to using digital imagery to reproduce stamps, etc., in potentially immense detail, and project the images or show them on display screens. But in the late Victorian and early Edwardian era, the optical apparatus named as an Aphengescope was a practical method of viewing stamps in great detail with image projected onto a screen. Now, this word that is difficult to pronounce, Aphengescope, it's all just Greek to me, I'd say, because, when I was researching all this and reading up about it, I found that in 1906, in a book about optical projection, that the authors had written that a simple instrument for exhibiting carte de visite and other opaque objects is often called the Aphengescope, but then their comment was, the mania for giving Greek names to lantern affairs is inexplicable to the ordinary mind. So they didn't quite understand why it needed to have such a Greek name. But more recently, in 2013, Paul Anthony Jones, in a book that he wrote about the origins of English, explains that the word is coined from a series of Greek roots, principally a meaning an absence or lack of something, phengos meaning light or luster, and then of course the suffix scope, which also comes from Greek skopos, which means target or meaning to watch or to look at. So now we can kind of see how this word is formed, because what we therefore have is that an Aphengescope is a device to allow one to look with a lack of light, i.e. the light doesn't go through it, it reflects off of it. So that's how they came up with the name. So that's my talk about the use of Aphengescopes by Philatelic Societies 1900 through 1910. I hope to have shed some light on the use of this optical apparatus, and in so doing to have contributed to your historical knowledge and understanding. Thank you.